Welcome to the Creating a Family podcast. I'm Tracy Whitney, the content manager for Creating a Family. Many of you have already heard the news that our executive director, Dawn Davenport, will be retiring this year. I've been co-hosting with her off and on this spring and learning the ropes as eventually I will become the podcast host. Today, I'm hosting solo, but have no fear, Dawn isn't gone yet, and you'll have plenty of other opportunities to hear from her before she retires. I'm excited today to talk with my friend Sheila Kowit. We met several years ago through our local adoptive mom community, and I know she'll be a great resource for today's topic. Sheila is an adoption social worker with Adoptions from the Heart, and Adoptions from the Heart is a nonprofit domestic open adoption agency licensed in 6 states on the East Coast. They are celebrating their 40th anniversary of serving the adoption community this year. In her capacity at Adoptions from the Heart, Sheila prepares home studies for domestic infant adoption and international adoption, and she provides counseling and support for expectant and birth parents and adoptive parents. Welcome, Sheila. I'm so glad to have you on the show today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
We're looking forward to talking about adoption home studies and what you need to know and how to allay any fears or nervousness that you might have as prospective adoptive parents. So we're going to jump right in, and we're going to start with basically a working definition of what is the adoption home study.
The adoption home study, unlike what many people think, is not a study of your home. While that is a piece of it, the home study overall is an opportunity for the agency to get to know you, to get to understand you, and to assess you and to see how appropriate you are to be able to be placed with a child through adoption. I heard on a recent Creating a Family podcast that talked about how to adopt in 2025 that the adoption home study should be looked at as a process as well as a product. It is a full process that you go through where you are assessed and evaluated by the agency. We learn about who you are, how you came to the decision to adopt, and then we make a determination as to whether or not we find that you are fit for this.
So when you're doing a home study for a family, is it possible to get one home study that works for all the types of adoption?
You would have a home study that would talk about what you are approved for in the state in which you live. So if you wanted to do a domestic infant adoption, which is what our agency mostly focuses on, we would assess you for the opportunity to adopt in that manner. If you were looking to adopt through an international process, you would also need to be working with an agency that would facilitate that adoption with you. And then we would work with that agency to see what criteria was necessary specific to the country you were looking for to adopt from, and then make determinations based on that to work into your home study as well.
So maybe a little bit of tweaking and adjusting if you are looking for an international adoption home study, your process with that family would be just a little bit different than it would be for, say, a domestic infant adoption.
Sure, because each country has its criteria and its qualifications that it's looking for. So we need to make sure that we address those things as well.
Great. Thank you. In order to educate and prepare these families, at what point do you start the process of a home study? And is it different in international adoption than it would be, say, for domestic infant adoption?
The home study has to happen first, initially, because you have to be home study approved in order to be considered for placement. The process of home study would vary depending on the agency that you work with, but the way our agency does it, we really find it critical to get to know you, to understand you, and to make sure that you are educated in the aspects of adoption that we find most relevant and most critical as you're parenting an adoptee. So we would meet with you several times before we would even sit down to start talking about what the criteria are for the home study. We have what's called a pre-counseling session when you first apply to the agency, where you come in and meet with the social worker. And it's a get to know you session, not only for us to get to know them a little bit, but for them to get to know us and what our processes and procedures are, and kind of get a sense of the timeline for the process. At the pre-adopt session, we'll also be determining what education level you're at and what you may need to have in terms of education in order to be at a point where you're be able to be approved for certain aspects of adoption and the child that you'd like to be placed with. So what do I mean by that? Our agency is an domestic open adoption agency. So we need to make sure that you understand what open adoption is, what the importance is of having a connection with birth family, of having the child understand what it is to be an adoptee and how they got to this process. We also place our families with children of different races. So we need to make sure that you have an understanding of what it is to be a transracial adoptive family and the facets that are involved with having a child in your home that is of a race different of yours. Along with that, we also talk about intersectionality, and we have courses related to being a child or person that identifies in a way that may be different than the way their parents identify. So we want to make sure that education is complete, as well as giving the families the tools to help educate others in their lives who are going to be a part of their child's life. So the education piece is something that is also going to be incorporated in that pre-work before we actually sit down to start the home study.
So it sounds like it takes several meetings and it happens over a period of maybe several months.
Yes, correct. So we have a timeline that from start to finish, it could take about 6 to 9 months before we're actually at a home study approval point.
Okay. And is that different for the international adoption home studies that you write?
Well, with the international, again, there may be facets of the country that the person is adopting from that may need to be incorporated. So that could have an impact on the timeline. But generally, the timeline's pretty consistent.
And with international adoption home studies, you're doing a lot of the same type of educating, country specific, culture specific, race specific.
Sure. We're certainly not necessarily addressing that individual country's culture, but we want people to think about what it means to be parenting a child of a different race and culture, and how are they going to make sure that those things are addressed in the life of their child as they're parenting that child.
And in general, can you speak to the cost of an adoption home study we'll start with domestic infant adoption?
The average cost would be about $2,000 to $3,000. There may be additional fees if education courses are necessary. In our full program, those courses are required. But if you're coming in with needing us just to write a home study for an international adoption, which would be called home study only, we would determine whether or not you needed that education and if those courses should be added in, or if you've sufficiently been educated through your placing agency or through other means.
And we should note at this point that some placing agencies wrap the cost of education into that flat fee that they would call their home study fee, and some itemize it separately and differently.
Yes, correct. And if nothing else, you should ask for clarification and transparency on all of those costs so that you know exactly what is being accounted for in those costs.
Let me pause for a moment and thank our partners, Vista Del Mar. Vista Del Mar is a licensed nonprofit adoption agency with over 65 years of experience helping create families. They offer home study only services, as well as full service infant adoption, international home study and post adoption, and foster to adopt programs for families. You can find them online at vistadelmar.org/adoptions. We are grateful for their support. All right. So when a family is moving into the home study process, what kind of information should they expect to provide to their home study agent? And what documentation are they looking for? And maybe speak a little bit as to how they go ahead and compile that, where they put it, what they do with it once they get it.
Sure. As I stated, this is an assessment process, and we are consistently and constantly throughout the process doing assessment and evaluation. So we have those pre-council meetings. We have home study session meetings where we talk specifically about the requirements of the home study document. We also use those meetings as opportunities, again, to get to know, to dig deeper into what is your motivation for adoption. How did you get to this point? Were there issues with fertility? What was your family like? How were you raised? How would you parent? What are parenting skills that you have? So all of these things are discussed in our home study sessions. They're also addressed in your home study autobiography. And that's a really big document that we ask for our parents to prepare for us, along with the logistical information about their lives, the financial information and the education and those kinds of things. But that autobiography really is a very key piece because it asks really intimate questions about you and who you are, your family, how you were raised, your education, what scrapes did you have as a child, maybe with the law? What failures did you have? What successes did you have? If you are a couple, how did you come together as a couple? How did you determine that this was the one for you? So it asks you to dig deep into who you are as a person and how you got to this point. And I've had families come back to me and say that they were so grateful for that process because it really, really solidified for them their reasons behind coming to adoption and why they value adoption and how connected they are to it. So as daunting a task as it may be when you sit down to do it, because I've had people come to me and say, Sheila, I've been writing 10 pages already. Is that too much? When do I need to stop? And I'm like, keep going, because that's how I get to know you. And that's how I get to assess you and make sure that this is where you're supposed to be. The autobiography is a big, big piece of the paperwork that they need to put together.
And it's probably useful for those who are already parenting to know that those questions will be included. How have you parented your children thus far? One piece that both my husband and I found pretty daunting when we were doing our international adoption studies was talking about how we were parented, kind of the philosophy maybe that our parents held when they were raising us. How did they discipline us? How did they reward us? How did they, acknowledge our growth and milestones, things like that? It felt like between the combination of the interviews and then the self-writing that we had to do, the self-assessments that we had to do in our own writing, felt very deep and introspective and in some ways a little probing. But, now that we're on the other side of it, we can see the value of that, as you mentioned at the beginning. So yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Do you see that international adoption home studies and domestic infant adoption home studies differ greatly in the actual documentation that families are required to compile, like the birth certificates and things like that?
Yeah, no, I haven't, because the regulations for the home study are state specific. So
Okay.
you're creating a home study that is approving you to adopt a child and according to the laws and regulations of the state in which you live. So the paperwork, the stuff that you're pulling together that goes way beyond if you've purchased a home, way beyond what you can think of for your mortgage. Those are state specific. If there are things that are needed, again, in an international study, then the placing agency would indicate what was needed for that country. Otherwise, you're going to follow state specific regulations. And those items that are included, and it is a lot. You're going to we give our families several months after we've had our home study sessions and meetings. We give them several months to pull these documents together before we sit down to write their home study. So you're looking at, there are certain policies that they have to agree to within our agency regarding discipline. And for us, they have questionnaires relating to transracial adoption. They have medical examination forms that they have to do. They have to have all of their clearances. For my state of Pennsylvania, it's Pennsylvania criminal background check, child abuse check, and then there's a PA fingerprint that has to be done for that other clearance. If they've lived outside of the state within a certain number of years, they're going to need clearances from the other states in which they lived. They have to give us information about their employment, verification of employment, verification of income, their tax returns. If they own a home, they need to give us copies of their lease and their deeds. If they own rental properties, if they don't own a home but are renting, then, like I said, they need their lease. They
Right.
need to tell us if there were any liens or bankruptcies that they've had. They need to let us know if they've ever been a foster parent. We need information of that. If the home study was ever completed in another state, we need information about that. We need verification of income for the last 10 years through the Social Security Administration. So we have pretty extensive requirements: health insurance, car insurance, life insurance. So it's going to take some real digging to pull all the paperwork together for submission.
Marriage licenses, birth certificates of the children living in the home, all that. It's a lot of paperwork and a lot of running around to get things notarized and stamped and approved. When we talk about the medical history, you touched on that a little bit. They're asked to complete medical history documentation. Are you aware of any specific medical diagnoses that could present maybe a yellow flag or a red flag for a home study agent? And how does that get handled if there are red flags like that?
Sure. I think it's important to note we're not doctors, we're not lawyers, we're social workers. And so the reason that we ask people for these verifications is that so the experts can give us information and feedback as to what the condition is of the applicant. So if there is a medical form done and they've gone to their doctor that they have a history with, then the doctor's going to tell us, and the form requests an answer to whether or not this person is in good medical health to be able to care for a child. You know, what is the degree of their health? Is it excellent? Is it good? Is it fair? Is it poor? Like, we're going to rely on the medical professional to give us that feedback. If there's something on there that needs further qualification or further explanation, then we'll ask for it. But we're going to rely on the professional to give us the go ahead as to whether or not they deem the person fit to take on this responsibility.
Okay, so that might be a situation then when a doctor says, yes, they've been on medication for, say, depression, and then the next step would be that a home study agent might recommend a sit down with a psych for an evaluation and kind of a vetting in that process,
Sure.
correct?
So if the person has presented with a mental health condition, we're going to ask for, they sign HIPAA forms with us. So we ask to be able to speak with their doctors, their therapists, their psychiatrists. And we're going to, again, dig a little deeper in, is this person in treatment? Are they being responsible with their medication? Have they presented to you in a way that shows that they are in a good, stable place to take on this responsibility? And not only in this moment, but do you foresee that they are on a course, that they are being well cared for, that they are following their treatment plan, that they are showing that this is something that they are prepared to do? So we are going to go back and rely on the professional to give us their professional opinion about how we should proceed. And what I appreciate about that is that we recognize that you're a human being. And we
Right.
recognize that everybody has stuff that's going on, and that we don't want to be the ones that tell you that you can't parent because you have a mental health condition. That's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to make sure that you are taking care of yourself and that you are taking steps to be able to manage your own health and your own care as well as that of a child.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, goes to that conversation. This is not a process that you should be afraid of or feel as if it's going to, list out all of your vulnerabilities for the world to see. It's really a process to protect you and prepare you for the child that will be placed in your home. When it comes to international adoption, many families worry because every country has its own requirements for physical and mental health issues. So families that might be looking for specific information can go to our adoption comparison charts on the Creating a Family website, creatingafamily.org. You go to the adoption dropdown and then you click on adoption comparison charts. And we list in that section the top 10 sending countries. We update them every year, the top 10 sending countries, and we list each factor that is important to know about parents and how they can qualify, as well as the children that they'll be welcoming into their home. Another great resource to help parents that are pursuing an international adoption is the uscis.gov website, where they talk about the individual countries and the ratio of income that is required. When you are looking at the physical and mental health issues of an adoption home study, if you are not a family that sees a doctor regularly and you don't maybe have a doctor of record, are you able to go to like an urgent care clinic or a minute clinic and get an adoption physical? And does that satisfy the requirements for most states?
It does satisfy the requirements of the states in which we work. So we have said that that is fine for people to go ahead and do that.
Okay. That's a quick, easy answer for people if they are not connected to a regular medical facility. So, when we're talking about a domestic infant adoption home study or an international adoption home study, I would imagine that some families might have concerns about criminal background checks or misdemeanors on their rap sheet, things that may have happened when they were young people. Can you talk a little bit about what parents need to know about the criminal background part of an adoption home study?
So, as we stated earlier, part of the process is having background clearances. So, you are going to have clearances from the state in which you live. And if you've lived in a state other than that, for us, it's within the last 5 years, then you're going to have it from that state as well, and any states in which you live. So, those are the, overall general proof of whether or not your background, your criminal history is clear. We have a verification form that we ask people to sign as well that does talk about any criminal history. And
Okay.
we ask for an explanation. We ask for an explanation. We ask for how things were adjudicated. And we ask for what have you learned? How have you grown since then? And we also look at what is your life like now and how are you living your life now? Again, much like with the mental health, we know that people are human and that people have made mistakes in their past. And that shouldn't mean that you can't parent a child through adoption. But we do need to make sure that it wasn't last week or last month, and that you are not still living in that way and behaving in that way. And if that is the case, then that's where it's going to be a red flag for us. And we're going to need to make some decisions that may not necessarily be in your favor. But if it's been adjudicated, if it's been expunged, or whatever has happened within the record, we need proof of it, and we need to have a conversation about what did you learn and how did you grow. And that's part of who you are and what's going to make you hopefully a good parent to this adoptee, and hopefully have an understanding of what your child might go through as they're learning and growing and exploring in their lives. Tracy, you and I both know with being parents of adoptees, there's stuff, there are issues, and we have to be able to have some compassion and tolerance and understanding.
Yeah, having that grace from experiencing your own struggles and your own challenges, and talking with your adoption caseworker very honestly and openly and vulnerably about, like you said, what you learned and how you've grown and changed since then, can also be great launching points for then how to prepare yourself to talk to your child as they experience challenges that may be different or similar, but that common ground of we're all human, we all make mistakes, we all struggle through challenges. And I love, the idea that that's kind of the point of the home study, is taking all of the things that have brought you to where you are today to prepare you for where you're going to go down the road with your child that you welcome into your family.
Yes. To be very frank, I wish many biological parents had to go through this process.
That's funny that you say that.
Because I know that the adoptive parents that have to take this time to be so self-reflective and to really look deeply at what their motivations and what their feelings are and how their experiences have shaped them, it makes them better parents. And I know a lot of children who would have benefited from their biological parents taking these measures as well.
Right. That thoughtful, introspective posture doesn't necessarily always happen for families that are having children kind of the old-fashioned way. And yeah, I love that. I am loving this interview, and I'm so thankful for Sheila's time today. I hate to interrupt, but I want you to know about our Weekend Wisdom podcast. Every Saturday morning, we publish a short form podcast, about 7 to 8 minutes long, sometimes 10. And we talk about the very practical parts of raising adoptive, foster, or relative children. We rely on your questions to do that. So if you have a question about adoption, foster care, or kinship care, send your questions to us at info@creatingafamily.org. We'll put them in the queue and spend some time researching and digging through our archives to find the answer to the question that you send us. Thanks so much, and don't forget to tell a friend about Weekend Wisdom every Saturday morning. Let's move into talking a little bit about the touchy topic of money. The money is a real hard one for a lot of families, and talking about their financial snapshot, where they are right now or where they've been, can be sticky. And we'd love to hear, your perspective about things like income and assets and documentation they have to provide. And again, maybe some of that thoughtful introspection as applied to the financial portion of the home study.
Sure. Adoption is incredibly expensive, particularly domestic infant adoption. So there needs to be a sign that you are going to be able to not only afford to parent this child, which in today's world is a great expense, but also to be able to afford the expenses of the adoption. So we have a great financial worksheet that our parents have to submit, along with, as I said earlier, they have to give us their credit card statements. They have to give us their investments, their 401ks. Like, we need proof of all their finances, their checking accounts, savings accounts, investment properties, if they have possessions that are of value. So we take a look at all of that, and we do a full assessment of what their assets are and what their expenditures are. And ultimately, we want them to come up on the positive side of that. That said, we're really looking at, can you afford, in the life that you're living, the expenses that come along with parenting a child, and the expenses that come along if your child has needs that go beyond the norm? Are you going to be able to manage medical expenses if that is the case? Therapies, vacations, because that's something that's really necessary for your family to build connection, just the stuff that it's expensive to parent children. So we need to make sure you have that. But we need to make sure that you're in a positive on a month-to-month basis. I have one of my favorite families that rents an apartment. They don't own their home. So they didn't have the benefit of the asset of owning a home. And so they came out on the negative when we were doing a comparison between their expenses and their income. We were able to justify that. We were able to see that, yes, aside from having that asset, which would have increased their financial value, they have the monthly income to be able to afford a child. They were getting gifted money towards the adoption expenses, which they had to detail and list. And they were getting grant money also, which they had to detail and list. So you just need to be able to tell us where the money's coming from. And you just need to be able to explain how you live your financial life. And again, we give you the space to give us the explanation and to tell us what's going on. And if it makes sense, then we can proceed. If it doesn't look like you're in a good financial place, or you've just lost your job, and you're not sure what your next move is going to be, then we may need to take some measures to see what's going to happen before making approval. We are finding that there are many grant opportunities out in the adoption community that will support not only people who maybe are at a greater financial need, but also those that are very financially sound and are also taking on this adoption opportunity. One such organization is called helpusadopt.org. They are amazing. They have lots of money to give, and they really are not basing it on income. They're basing it on personal stories. and they give people an opportunity to apply multiple times. So you can, I believe they do their disbursements quarterly, and you can apply time and time and time again. So I just wanted to put that out there because we found them to be an amazing organization that is supporting all families that are looking to adopt. But there are many, many others that will assist with those adoption expenses.
And Creating a Family has some recent resources on grants and how to find grants. We actually have a great guest article about grants breaking down financial barriers for families that listeners might be interested in. So let's talk a little bit about that personal history. You alluded to it at the beginning of the conversation, and we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive now. This part of the adoption home study tends to be probably the most fraught for families. It feels very personal, sometimes intrusive, but I'd love for you to talk about why we shouldn't be nervous about this part of the home study, that personal history that includes all of our autobiography, so to speak, and if you see any differences in domestic infant adoption home study versus the international adoption home study for the personal history part.
I can't say that I see any differences. You know, we're still looking at the individuals for who they are, and we're using that space to share in the home study who these people are and how they got to be to this point. So it doesn't really seem to me that there's any differences between the two versions of adoption that you're pursuing. This is the place where you really just, as you said, lay yourself bare. And each social worker is going to use that in the way that suits them. I tend to be an elaborate writer. My home study documents are upwards of 15 or 16 pages, which sometimes I've been asked to cut them back a little bit. But I also think about the opportunities that my children have had to look at my and my husband's home study and see how we got to the point to bringing them into our lives. So it really is something for me that is a part of my child's adoption story. So I really, for my families, want to make sure that I'm conveying as much as I can about who they are and what got them to this point. So that said, we're looking at, you know, who you are, your personal profile, an introduction of yourself, a description of, actually, we do put in there a physical description of who you are, your height, your weight, your eye color, your hair color, your age, your birthday. Then we start going into family composition, you know, parents, step-parents, siblings, step-siblings, if there's other children that you're parenting. We look at relationships between those people. I had someone recently that has like 2 step-parents and then children, you know, that are siblings with each of those step-parents. So we want to know what those connections are. What does your family look like? If you're alone on an island and you have no family connections, that might be something that would be of concern to us. What is that going to mean for your child? And how are you going to make sure you build a community for your child if you had not built one for yourself? So that's something, especially when we have single adopters, we need to make sure that they have a community, that they have people around them that are going to be there for them and their child as they go through life together. We look at what was your childhood like, you know, from childhood, adolescence, what hardships did you encounter? What was school like for you? What activities were you involved in? What were some highlights? What were some of the struggles that you went through? What were some of the hardships? Maybe you had a loss of a parent, or you moved around a lot, or there was substance abuse in your family. So we need to know about those things. We need to hear about how they impacted you. If you are gay, we ask about, you know, what was that like for you growing up? How was your coming out? You know, we ask people to discuss that. If you're in a partnership, how did you meet? What was your courtship like? How did you decide to get married? You know, what was your marriage like? What is your marriage based on? What is the foundation for your relationship? What are your values? What are things that you enjoy doing together? What are areas of stress in your relationship? How do you both feel about making this decision to adopt? Who got there first? How did the other get there? So we're really digging very, very deeply into who you are as an individual and who you are as a couple if you're coming to us in that way.
Can I ask a question in the
Sure.
middle of that? When a couple is coming to adoption, must they be married or can there be long-term partnerships that are approved?
Yes, you can have a long-term partnership approved. You do not need to be married.
Okay. And for international adoption, that differs per country. And again, families can use the resource of the adoption comparison charts to understand which countries accept single parents or married parents or couples in long-term relationships. Thanks.
You're welcome. I would imagine that's also true for sexual identities as well, that
Yes.
the international
Yep.
countries are specific
Yep.
about that as well. We ask about your lifestyle, what your hobbies and interests are, how do you spend your time, what's your work life like, how do you balance work life, relationship, hobbies, and interests. We ask about religion. It's not important that you have or don't have. We just ask, what you do practice and how you incorporate that into your life and will incorporate it into your parenting. Then we start to talk about parenting experiences, issues, attitudes, nurturing, discipline. You mentioned that earlier. It really made you start to think about how you were parented and maybe what you liked about how you were parented or what you'd like to do differently. We also encourage in our home study sessions to think about what will parenting look like for an adoptee and what might some issues be that maybe conventional parenting needs to be perceived differently when you're talking
Mhm.
about parenting an adoptee. So that's kind of reflected on in that section as well. We ask about what your plans are when you are placed with a child. So what are your child care plans going to be? How much time are you going to be able to be at home once you're placed? And then who's going to be the caregiver for the child? So we ask you to think about that. We understand that that's not set in stone, but we want to know that you are thinking about your next steps as a parent. If you've dealt with infertility and childness, we ask that you address that in this section and give us some real feedback as to how you've processed that and moved on from it. In our program, you can't actively be working in fertility while you're working in adoption. So we need to know that
Mhm.
if you were pursuing a biological child and you faced infertility, you've closed the door, you've grieved that, and you've moved on now to this next big methodology for becoming a parent.
And that's agency specific, correct?
That's for our agency.
Yeah.
Some agencies may not have that particular policy.
And also maybe different for international adoption, depending
Correct.
on the agency or the country that you're working with.
Correct. Again, we talk about adoption issues and motivations, making sure they really understand what it means to parent an adoptee. And you're not just doing this as a second best or as, an alternative plan. Like what really brought you here? Why did you connect to adoption? What was it that made you take these extreme measures to proceed in parenting in this way? We ask about views on expectant and birth parents and openness in adoption. As I said, we are an open adoption agency, and we really need to make sure that our adoptive parents are understanding of what openness means and have certain values that align with ours in regard to birth parents and their choices in making an adoption plan. So there's detailed questions regarding that.
And if you are working with an infant adoption agency that does not bring that conversation up, prospective parents should absolutely feel free to be the ones to bring it up. And hopefully, in the process of choosing an agency, you will have already asked, how do you feel about open adoption? How do you help facilitate open adoption? But again, along the way, if that does not come up in the home study from the social worker side of the conversation, prospective parents should absolutely feel free to bring that up and say, hey, can we get some education on this? Can we talk about this? Can you help us kind of craft a plan? And certainly, crafting the plan in the home study process does not mean that you're held to that when the actual adoption occurs. But it's good, like you said earlier, to have a working plan, an idea, or some preparatory information about what you want it to look like so that you can move forward down the road with knowledge and from a position of strength.
Absolutely. And the flip side of that, Tracy, is if we don't feel that you really have a full breadth and understanding and commitment, to what we
Mm-hmm.
understand to be as open adoption, then we won't approve you to be in an open adoption. We can approve you for adoption, but it may be not either not open or limited openness. So that, especially in our agency, is a big piece of the puzzle, making sure that we feel confident that you can proceed in that way.
Do you know about the library of free courses thanks to our partners at the Jockey Being Family Foundation? You can take one or all 15, and they will equip you and strengthen you to parent your family well. They're applicable to adoptive families, foster families, and kinship families alike. And you can go to bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support, and check out the courses today. Can you talk a little bit about families that already have children in the home and how the children in the home are included in the home study process, obviously depending upon their age and their understanding, and how you handle kids that may not be on board with their parents' plan to adopt?
Sure. One piece of the process is actually going out to the home. So there is actually a home inspection that is part of the process. And at that home inspection is generally when we will meet all members of the family or whomever is living within the home. And we need to speak to each of the people living the home and to understand how they feel about all of the adoption process and bringing an adoptee into the home. So to your point, if they are already parenting a child, that has to be discussed within the autobiography, and that child will have a full physical description and a profile description as would the adoptive parents. So that those children are also fully described within the home study. When we have the meeting, we do sit down with them and talk to them about how they feel about this process and what their connection to adoption is, and make sure that they are feeling confident that this is how they would like to proceed as well. If there is any feeling that they are not in the same mindset that their parents are, then that's a conversation that we have to have before we can move forward with an approval.
Okay. When a family is putting together this autobiographical essay or filling out the guide that their home study agent gives them, is there a space for references, personal references? And how do you, as a prospective parent, identify who would be the valuable references to share with your agency?
Our agency asks for 5 references.
Okay.
We have a separate form that we send out to the people that our prospective adoptive parents identify, and it is kept confidential between them and us. So they submit it back to us. We ask that at least 3 of them know both parties.
Okay.
So of the 5, at least 3 need to know both parties. And then if they don't have that, then we need more so that we make sure that we have at least 3 that cover both of them. You should pick people. It can't be a relative, can't be your parents for our agency. Other agencies may have specific requirements, but it should be people that have seen you with children, that know how you are. So maybe it's relatives of yours that have, nieces or nephews or cousins that you've had some time that you spent with, that you've babysat or gone on vacation with. If you've worked in any capacity with children, if you're a Girl Scout leader or a Cub Scout or a teacher, somebody that has seen you engage with children, so that they can speak on that. But even if they haven't seen you with children, they're going to speak on your character, on how they perceive you as a couple, how they perceive you as prospective parents. So it really needs to be people who know you. It's not going to be somebody that you met, last week or last month. It's going to be somebody who has a real intimate knowledge of you and your relationship.
And a long-term relationship, I'm assuming, not somebody you just met last year.
No, I mean, if there is somebody that is in there, but they have a really significant role in your life, then I wouldn't disclude them.
Okay.
But I would like to see people that have known you longer term also.
Great. And you touched a couple minutes ago on the home inspection. We don't have to spend a ton of time on it because you have talked about the home inspection meeting often includes the long interview process of the individuals living in the home. But what are some of the physical things that you're looking for when you do a home inspection part of a home study?
Sure. And it's funny because this is what people really worry about as well. And
Right?
I hear all kinds of things. Well, we have some architecture in our home that I'm coming out to the home. I need to make sure it's clean, safe, and appropriate for a child. So I need to make sure that, and I don't expect that you're going to have all of your child safety locks and all of your gates and all of that up, but I need to know that you're thinking about that, and we'll identify places that you're going to want to make sure that are secured for when you bring a child into the home. We want to make sure that the walls are all intact, that the carpeting's intact. Yeah, we really just want to make sure that the environment is appropriate for a child. I've heard stories, thankfully, I've not experienced them, where the home has needed attention and the social worker has had to make recommendations for that attention to take place before they could approve the home study. So that could possibly happen. But if you take those measures and we come out and we re-inspect, then everything should be fine. But we also want to make sure that you have your medications locked up, that you, if you have firearms in the home, that you have a safe and that they're put away, and that everything is secure in the environment.
Okay. How about pets?
We love that you have pets in your home, but they all need to have their vet records. That's part of
Okay.
what you have to provide to us. They have to make sure they're all vaccinated. We have to make sure that there's no issues with them. So yeah, we are checking on your pets as well.
I'll never forget our first home study. We timing had gone off the rails a little bit because one of our kids had an accident. And so we were in the middle of gutting our family room. And when she walked in, there was a huge tarp covering the whole back half of the house because it was down to the studs and we were trying to get it done. And we had to stop in the middle of the process to take care of our son who'd been in the hospital for a couple of days. So our whole home study was done with this big dark brown tarp hanging over the back half of the house.
That's funny.
Thankfully, she could see our vision for what the room was going to become, and she knew when she came back for the next visit, we had made significant progress and no tarp. So
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I think the big picture in all of this is, again, coming back to, we know that you're human and we know that you're living your life and we know that things happen in people's lives. And so we just need to understand, what are the measures that you're taking to address them? How are you making sure that when you bring a child into this home, that they are going to be safe and secure? So that's the
right.
bottom
It goes
line.
back to that question that we asked at the beginning. Should I be nervous? No, you shouldn't be nervous. You should be open and vulnerable and honest and assume that they're wanting you to succeed in this process because they want you to build your family through adoption. All right, let's talk a little bit about the education portion of an adoption home study, specifically the parenting training that you most often will offer to families. And you can talk about, I'd love for you to talk about maybe the differences between domestic and international home studies as it pertains to things like corporal punishment, or some of the other hot topics maybe would be sleep training or anything like that that parents would be needing some extra education on.
Sure. So we have a set in our full program. We have 3 to 4 courses that every family has to take. One of them is on open adoption. One of them is on transracial adoption. One of them is on intersectionality. And then the fourth one, which is an optional one, is on a non-newborn placement. So if you think that you would like to be placed with a child who is over 12 months old, then in our program, you're required to take that course as well. That's probably one of my favorite courses. And I really encourage all my families to take it because it really does get into nitty gritty about parenting adoptees in particular. Along with those, we have to also have a prenatal substance exposure course that all
Mm-hmm.
of our families take, and then a basic child care course so that when they walk out of the hospital with the infant, that they know how to care for an infant. So, and we have a lovely online course that's like 6 hours that was designed for specifically child caring for an adoptee. So, but if you didn't want to do that, you go to your hospital and you could do any, child care class that any pregnant person would be going through before they have a
Okay.
baby. Beyond those, when we sit in our home study sessions before you actually sit down to start putting your paperwork together, we do talk about issues related to parenting. We do talk about discipline and how do you think you'll handle it if there's attachment to one parent versus the other, and what are your feelings about cell phones, and what about overnights and sleepovers at people's houses. So we do talk about a lot of things that we really want to encourage, and we brought it up in the autobiography. How were you parented versus how do you think you would parent, or how are you wanting to parent, and then how are you wanting to parent an adoptee, because that does add a different layer. So during those home study sessions is really where we address a lot of those issues as well. If your agency does not do that, there are so many resources out there that you should take advantage of. And I always look at this period, including the waiting period, as a learning opportunity. That's really your space where you're going to just delve into, what do I need to know to parent an adoptee? And there's so many resources, and I always use Creating a Family. All of my families know that's my go-to personally as an adoptive parent, and that's where I send them for coursework and podcasts and blogs. But there are so many resources. Our agency has on-demand webinars that we offer. We have a YouTube series called AFTH TV, where we talk to all different members of the adoption triad. And we use National Council for Adoption for a ton of webinars and learning opportunities also for our families.
Do you ever find that you need to hone in on maybe a specific style or type of issue that maybe a family is looking for, or you have identified that they need additional help, and how does that get handled? Do they feel comforted by that? Do you feel like you get pushback from that?
Well, I think definitely the big thing is open adoption. I think open
Mm-hmm.
adoption and transracial adoption are the big things that we really need to make sure that people have a clear understanding. They're not going to know it all, and they're not going to understand it all. And some of it you
Mm-hmm.
need to be in, but those would probably be the areas where we see the most vulnerability and where we would ask people to take additional education on those.
Right.
I've not personally had any pushback from anybody that I asked about that. And they've appreciated the opportunity to explore those areas more. And if it comes back that they have had all that education and still are not feeling like they comport with what our beliefs are, then again, we may approve them for a different type of adoption than what our agency offers.
Okay. And I think a lot of times in international adoption, agencies and home study agents often will hone in on child-specific requirements, like the specific need of an identified child, whether it's a medical need or a cognitive need or a developmental need. I think sometimes when it comes to child-specific training, I think many countries have a kind of a group of needs that are more commonly sent from their country to the US. And so home study agents will often require an international adoption home study to include understanding and learning and education about that group of specific needs, whether it's prenatal exposure or limb differences or things like that. And those child-specific requirements are also something that you can learn more about at the adoption comparison charts.
Yes, and that would be something that we would be heavily reliant on the placing agency to share with us what those needs are and what those requirements are. And then we would guide the family as to where they could get the education support for that.
Great. Thank you. That's very helpful. Is there anything else that you want to add before we kind of wrap it up to encourage families not to be nervous about their home study?
Yes, I do just want to say, I know that you took a lot of time and care to get to this point. And if you
Mm-hmm.
can perceive the home study as just a continuation of the time and care that you've put in and look at it as a positive, it is going to be something that you are going to benefit from. I've had so many families come back to me afterwards and feel so emotional when they were reading through the finished document and really feel like it was such a hallmark to how they've begun their parenting journey and really valued it. So yes, it is a cumbersome process and it is going to require a lot of you. But like every cumbersome process that requires a lot of out of you, there's so much value to it. And on the other side, I think you're really going to appreciate the work that you put in and the resulting product that you're going to get out of it.
And the only thing I would add to that is when it does feel cumbersome and it does feel intrusive and it does feel like you've got, 10 more documents that you have to compile and get notarized, just keep in mind your why. You are doing this for the best interest of the child that you are dreaming of welcoming into your home, and holding that why up in front of you as you're going through the hard parts of whether it be the home study process or any other part of the adoption process. Holding up your why will help you get over those obstacles more easily. Thank you, Sheila, for your time. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for keeping us on track for all the different parts of a well-crafted adoption home study, whether it be domestic infant or international, the comparisons and the similarities between them. It's been a great layout for us to understand what it is, why we need it, and why we shouldn't be nervous about it. So thanks for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.